I'm Sarah Woodbury, and this is a walk and talk today to provide some background on some of my Native American characters in the After Kilmary series.
So most of your books and the content you create revolves around Wales and the history of Wales, and mainly the medieval period between what dates?
Well, for the After Kilmary series in particular.
Well, any of your books.
Any of books. So the earliest would be sometime in what's called the Dark Ages, maybe the 6th century.
Yeah.
And to around 1300
Yeah,
at the latest.
Around the 1300s is the latest.
Right.
However, you do have some characters because the After Kilmary series involves universe shifting or time travel or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
You have characters from the contemporary world.
Right, and in particular in the latest book, Legacy of Time, as well as some of the earlier books, we come and visit
Northeast Oregon.
Northeast Oregon.
Yes, and that's because you have a character, Cassie, who's a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation.
Right.
And we were thinking that it would be fun to do a little video providing some historical background for Cassie and her heritage, and why it's interesting that she is actually in medieval Wales.
That's right, and how, in a sense, she got swept up in this whole adventure in the first place.
Yes, yes. And so, in fairness, I'm going to talk a little bit here because I actually worked as an employee for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation for more than 10 years, and then have done contract work since then, on and off. And one of the projects that I worked on was a historical place names atlas for the tribes, which I'll put a link to that in the description of the video, so if you want to go check it out, you can. But the tribes are a plateau tribe, so they're from the inland Northwest, and as they say, they have been here for time immemorial, meaning that they've been here as long as people can remember. And they were here before Europeans, obviously. And in, you know, I don't know, when did Lewis and Clark come through? Was
early 1800s.
Early 1800s.
1806-ish.
Yeah, and so by the mid 1800s, actually 1855 is when they signed a treaty with the United States government. And there was a gentleman named Governor Stevens working for the U.S. government. Actually, he was the governor of the Oregon Territories, right?
I think so.
And he negotiated treaties simultaneously with all of the plateau tribes, which are the area east of the Cascade Mountains and west of the Rocky Mountains, essentially the inland Northwest. And the Nez Perce tribe at that time had a significant military capability that they wanted to mitigate. And so they met at a place near Walla Walla, Washington, what is now Walla Walla, Washington, and they negotiated with a whole bunch of tribes at the same time. And so there are a whole bunch of tribes in the inland Northwest that have similar treaties that were all signed in 1855 or around there. And those treaties actually reserve, what the tribes did was they said, we will trade a certain amount of the land that you recognize we control right now for certain rights that will last in perpetuity. And so the Umatilla tribe basically traded what they called their ceded lands that they ceded to the federal government of the U.S.
Lands we're walking on right now.
Lands we're walking on right now. For reserved lands that they weren't ceding, where their reservations now are, plus they reserved the right for all traditional uses on those ceded lands or in other lands that they can show that they've used historically. Because there's the hard lines that, you know, the U.S. government drew on the map were really a a bit of a fantasy. So that's why in, which book is it? Outcast in Time? No.
Are we talking about Exiles in Time?
Exiles in Time. Exiles, outcasts, they're all the same, right? This is why I'm not a writer.
Yes. Well, in Exiles in Time, where,
Yes.
spoiler, Callum comes upon Cassie, who has spent the last 5 years in Scotland, in the medieval world,
Yes.
which she got there having been swept up in a time travel event
That
by
happened in the Wallowa Mountains.
in the Wallowa Mountains, exactly.
Which is somewhat east of where we are right now.
Yeah.
And historically, the Umatilla tribe, which is a confederate, actually, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation is a confederation of 3 tribes. The Walla Walla branch of the Nez Perce, the Cayuse tribe, and the Umatilla tribe. And tribal members often move between tribes because, like I said, the boundaries were flexible. And so one of the things that they did, they were migratory, and they have what they called the seasonal round, where with the weather and the availability of resources, they moved annually. And often, the members of the tribes that now form the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, or CTUIR as we fondly call them,
Yep.
they would winter on the Columbia River, where we are right now, because it tends to be warmer, because you get this lovely marine layer of warm air coming up off the ocean, even though we're 200 miles from the ocean
Right.
here. And you can see there's a bit of a fog in the air. There's a mist, and that is that layer that you expect to see here. Now, so in the winter they'd be here, but in the summer, it's cooking hot here. It sucks to be here. It's you can tell by looking around at the foliage. It's essentially a high desert, and so in the summer, they head east into the mountains, and so they would travel all the way up into the Wallowa Mountains, or the Elkhorns, or various other ranges. And so Cassie would have been hunting with her grandfather in the Wallowa Mountains, which is part of the ceded territories of the CTUIR. And that's why she was there.
Yeah, very good.
So that may be more information than everybody wanted to get. But
Yeah.
I thought, Sarah thought, you want to say this?
We both thought
We thought
that it would be great to provide some background to how all this fits together between medieval Wales and members of the Confederated Tribes in the
Yes.
Middle Ages.
Well, and one of the interesting things that I should point out, after spewing that out directly from my memory, I am not a tribal member.
No.
My grasp of this may be flawed, but I think the basic shape of the story is correct. And if you're interested, go read the book. Actually, there's a tribal history book as well, which I'll put a link to,
Right.
which was written by the tribes. And those are the authoritative places you should get that information. But one of the other interesting things, just before we wrap up about all of this, is that we have a number of friends who are tribal members, and you've actually talked to some of them about writing and about what you write about.
And what I write about, and I wouldn't potentially say this if I would feel a little presumptuous to say this, but at the same time, because they've said it, that the history of the Confederated Tribes, or what happened to Native Americans in this area, is somewhat reflective of what happened to the Welsh in Wales in the Middle Ages.
There are similarities.
Similarities in terms
And-
of the conquest, in terms of sort of a sense of being relegated to smaller areas, certainly in the suppression of the language, in what happened in the schools in the 20th century.
Yeah.
These kinds of things that the Welsh experienced in Wales bear strong resemblance to what some Native Americans experienced many
In the U.S.
in the U.S. and particularly here
Yeah.
with the Confederated tribes.
And obviously it's not the same, but as you said, when we've talked about whales and why you're interested in whales
Yeah.
and what you find compelling about whales, a lot of that history bears some parallels
Yeah.
that have been pointed out to us by our friends who are tribal members.
Yeah. This is a 360
Yeah.
video. You'll see the Columbia River out there looking lovely and blue today.
Yes.
It did not look like that
No, it
in
didn't.
1855. This is a lake, effectively.
A reservoir.
A reservoir. And there's a whole series of dams, hydroelectric dams along the Columbia that were built in the 50s and 60s by the Army Corps of Engineers. Provides hydroelectric power to the Pacific Northwest, which is great. But it did also cover over fishing sites for tribal members.
Yeah. For many tribes.
Many tribes. And as well as places, there were islands there that were drowned,
Yes. Submerged.
when the dams were built. So just so if this is, even as we're walking here on this lovely, somewhat isolated space, you can sort of think back to an earlier time where maybe
Yes.
it looked very similar, except it actually wouldn't have looked quite like this.
We're also walking on an old railroad grade.
Railroad grade.
So,
And there's, cell towers in the distance.
yes. Yeah, so there are limits.
Yes. But this is, what a landscape of Eastern Oregon that Cassie would have seen every day of her life.
Growing up.
Yep, growing up. And if you're ever driving along Interstate 84 in Eastern Oregon, you can stop at the Temustalik Cultural Institute, which is a fantastic award-winning museum, and it also has a great gift store and bookshop. Thanks for watching my video. You can click on the playlist or subscribe to my channel to see more. There'll be a new video next week. If you want to check out my books, click on the link to my webpage.